Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. If you're the kind of person who loves breaking down fascinating, complex texts just to understand what makes them tick, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're taking an objective, structured look at the foundational arguments in Chapter 1 of Ryuho Okawa's The Laws of Salvation. We're going to unpack the author's core thesis right from the ground up.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The book kicks off with a massive, almost mystery-like question. Why is religion fundamentally necessary in the modern age? Okawa argues that our modern society has completely lost sight of something essential. And this text, it's his attempt to explain exactly why that happened, and more importantly, how to fix it.
So, our source material for today is Okawa's The Laws of Salvation. We're going to map out the architecture of his beliefs here. What exactly is his thesis? Who's he critiquing? And what is the ultimate call to action he presents to his followers?
Here is our roadmap for today. First, why religion is necessary. 2, humans as spiritual beings. 3, the blind spots of education and media. 4, the new salvation movement. And finally, 5, the mission of spreading the word.
All right, let's get into Section 1, Why Religion is Necessary.
Right off the bat, Okawa grounds his whole argument in this profound, really urgent sense of mission. He points out that he's been preaching continuously, literally without rest, for over 25 years. He's published over 600 books and produced multiple films. And he frames this massive output not just as, a resume, but as hard evidence of a burning responsibility to deliver truths from a higher spiritual realm.
He looks at this necessity through a really specific historical lens. Think about it. Roughly 2,500 years have passed since the death of the Buddha, right? And Okawa argues that teachings from millennia ago, even if they were originally universal, naturally struggle to hold up against the crazy, rapid changes of our modern era. So, to spark a true new civilization, he asserts that a brand new teaching absolutely has to be born.
Moving right along to Section 2, Humans as Spiritual Beings.
Now, Okawa's entire philosophy rests on this one unavoidable premise. Humans are spiritual beings, and the spirit dwells in the physical body. And he doesn't just treat this like some poetic metaphor. For him, this is concrete reality. It's presented as the absolute bedrock of all major world religions.
But here's the catch, and Okawa readily admits this. Accepting this spiritual reality is often life's first and, honestly, hardest hurdle. And he points the finger directly at modern, highly educated people. He argues that society's elites are actually the ones who are most likely to stumble at this very foundational step. Kind of ironic, right?
Which brings us to Section 3, Blind Spots of Education and Media.
So, if society is failing to grasp this fundamental truth, whose fault is it? Well, Okawa draws this massive contrast between a secular and a spiritual worldview, putting the blame squarely on modern institutions. He argues that schools completely ignore the spiritual dimension. They teach a version of reality that only acknowledges the physical world, basically leaving people totally unprepared for the soul's eternal journey. And his critique of the press, it's really pointed. He claims that mass media in modern democracies utterly fails the public when it comes to religion. They either remain completely indifferent, just pretending faith doesn't even exist, or they only report on it when there's some juicy scandal. This lack of active, positive affirmation, according to the text, deeply, deeply skews society's perception.
All right, Section 4, The New Salvation Movement.
To counter all this spiritual blindness, Okawa outlines a brand new salvation movement, and it's built on 3 highly specific pillars. First, actively teaching the spiritual view of life that schools ignore. Second, teaching the right way to live. And third, firmly establishing religion as a necessary force for good in the public eye.
The really crucial detail here is how he defines that right way to live. He argues that earthly laws, they just aren't enough. Right and wrong are ultimately judged by heavenly standards dictated by a supreme being. And understanding this is absolutely vital, because your adherence to these heavenly standards directly impacts the trajectory of your soul after death.
And finally, Section 5, Mission of Spreading the Word.
To motivate his followers, Okawa makes a remarkably bold theological claim here. He says the era of temporary teachings is over. He declares that we are currently living in the time of Buddha's rebirth and the descent of a supreme being named Cantare. And because of this monumental, earth-shattering event, there's an absolute mandate to spread these teachings to the very ends of the earth.
But how does a person even act on a massive global mandate like that? Well, the text says, by starting incredibly small. The chapter wraps up by emphasizing that massive change doesn't always need grand gestures. Just handing out a single pamphlet or inviting a friend to watch a film, these are small actions that when multiplied by thousands of people can create a massive wave of light.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. If society were to completely abandon its secular focus and universally adopt the heavenly judged lens advocated in this text, how would our global future functionally change? It's a pretty provocative question, and it's exactly what the rest of the author's work attempts to answer. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking Chapter 2 of Ryuho Okawa's The Laws of Salvation. And what makes this text so fascinating to analyze is how it seamlessly weaves together these massive, ethereal spiritual doctrines with highly specific everyday sociopolitical stances. We're essentially going to look at how a belief system addresses the eternal destination of the human soul in one breath and then pivots right into national economic policy in the next. It's a really unique synthesis, so let's get into it.
Here is a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the afterlife according to happy science, the purpose of life's trials, the text's views on the state and economy, some really unique takes on global warming, and finally the concept of salvation through strong faith.
Starting off with Section 1, the afterlife and happy science, focusing on the spiritual guarantees the text lays out.
Right away, the author asserts a pretty remarkable track record. He claims that since starting the happy science movement back in 1986, not a single known believer has gone to hell. Now, the text explicitly mentions that this includes people who really struggled in life, folks who dealt with severe illness, unexpected accidents, or who perhaps even had a poor attitude or were troubled by negative spirits. According to the book, all of them have still managed to return to heaven. The author views this as an absolute, undeniable testament to the movement's spiritual efficacy.
Taking that claim a step further, the text states the movement actively produces bodhisattvas and angels. And what's interesting here is how it defines that. The book explains it isn't just about surface-level good deeds. Instead, if a person possesses a genuine, deep-seated desire to help others from the very bottom of their heart, the afterlife properly evaluates that raw intent. So even if someone completely lacked the power or resources to fully realize those desires while they were alive, or if they were just bogged down by their own personal worries, their pure intent ensures they are guided to these higher angelic realms.
Moving into Section 2, Life's Trials Forge the Soul. This begs the question, if heaven is practically guaranteed, why is life in the physical world so incredibly difficult?
While the author explicitly rejects the idea of a simple, problem-free life, a life perfectly laid out on rails with no bumps or detours, that is dismissed outright. Instead, the text argues that everyone is destined to face specific, tailored trials. And why is that? Because these trials act like a forge. The idea is that it is strictly through hardship that the soul is polished, trained, and ultimately made stronger. Basically, every difficulty you face is framed as a pre-planned spiritual exercise meant for your growth. So the crucial takeaway here is absolute personal responsibility. The author states that while trials are guaranteed to come to each and every person, it is entirely up to the individual to use their, quote, wisdom and effort to overcome them. You can't simply sit back and wait for divine intervention to bail you out. You are expected to actively engage with your challenges to pass the spiritual test.
All right, Section 3, State and Economy via Religion. This is where we abruptly pivot to see how this spiritual worldview critiques modern government. It really bridges the gap between the divine and the daily news. The book outlines some very specific, real-world political grievances. The author forcefully argues that the government is pushing misguided policies right now, and he specifically calls out environmental tax hikes. The text warns that penalizing carbon emissions and continually raising taxes will only plunge the nation into a long-term economic recession. Instead, the author strongly advocates for a vibrant, consumer-led economy. He stresses that rather than tightening the purse strings and embracing austerity, the nation should be actively fostering exciting new industries to stimulate massive growth.
This all builds into a core political philosophy for the movement. According to the author, implementing restrictive environmental taxes fundamentally misunderstands a government's actual job. In this worldview, the primary overriding duty of the state is simply enriching the nation. Wealth creation and fostering hope are seen not just as economic imperatives, but almost as the spiritual duties of the state, directly opposing any policies based on restriction or austerity.
Which leads us to Section 4, Unique Views on Global Warming. To justify completely rejecting those environmental taxes, the author fundamentally redefines the cause of climate change itself.
The author pushes back heavily against mainstream climate science, and he actually coins a pretty striking term for it: carbon totalitarianism. This is his critique of the global consensus that CO2 is unilaterally evil. The text argues that treating carbon as an absolute enemy and forcing sweeping, mandatory emission cuts will universally damage economies. He argues this will severely hurt developing nations in particular, causing widespread and completely unnecessary suffering.
So, you might be wondering, if CO2 isn't causing global warming in this worldview, what on earth is? Well, the text presents a highly unconventional alternative. It claims that Earth is currently entering a cosmic zone called the photon belt. The author uses a really vivid analogy here, stating that Earth is actually being heated from the inside out, much like food in a microwave oven. This internal geothermal heat, not atmospheric CO2, is what the author claims is raising surface temperatures worldwide.
Let's just quickly compare these two models exactly as they are presented in the book. On one side, you have the mainstream CO2 theory, which the author claims is just being used unfairly as an excuse for aggressive taxation. And on the other side, you have his photon belt theory. The author completely replaces human-caused climate change with this cosmic, cyclical phenomenon. Furthermore, the text predicts that once Earth passes entirely through this photon belt, the planet will actually experience global cooling. Therefore, the author concludes that our current political policies based on CO2 reduction are fundamentally scientifically flawed.
Finally, Section 5, The Salvation of Strong Faith. How does the book tie together personal salvation, economic policy, and galactic climate theories? Let's take a look.
The text anchors its entire philosophy in the concepts of eternal life and reincarnation. The author explains that humans live not just once, but countless times, experiencing illness, accidents, and failures in absolutely every single lifetime. Because existence is just this endless, continuous cycle of trials, strong faith is presented as the vital, unshakable tool you need to navigate these continuous lifetimes of tragedy and learning without completely losing your way.
The book firmly asserts that its core teachings contain immense, highly practical power. Specifically, it points to the Dharma of the right mind, which is the central sutra of the faith. The text states that the salvation power of this specific teaching is incredibly potent. It's designed to save believers from both spiritual despair in the afterlife and very real worldly struggles in the present. It is framed as the ultimate anchor in a totally chaotic universe.
And the chapter concludes with a really striking, deeply personal appeal from the author. He urges readers to hold on to their faith with absolutely everything they have. He actually goes so far as to say that even if you suspect you are being tricked by him, you should maintain your faith anyway. His promise is profound. He guarantees that this faith will keep you out of hell. And if it turns out to be wrong, he asks for forgiveness from the heavens, asserting his only true desire is to save as many people as possible.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've just seen a philosophy that seamlessly connects the spiritual polishing of the soul to strict opposition against carbon taxes, all driven by a belief in cosmic microwave phenomena. Consider how this unique synthesis of the deeply ethereal and the intensely pragmatic impacts the real world today. How does such absolute spiritual certainty shape the way believers engage with our modern political and scientific landscapes? It is absolutely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. Catch you next time.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are objectively unpacking the third chapter of Ryuho Okawa's The Laws of Salvation. We're going to focus on a really fascinating aspect of the text, the author's argument for humanity's urgent need for spiritual evolution in the face of mounting global crises. We'll be looking closely at how the book connects our everyday, individual mindset directly to the geopolitical future of the world.
Here is how we're going to break this down. First, generating your own energy. Second, heavenly warnings through crises. Third, balancing material and spiritual. Fourth, the new Asian era. And finally, Japan's vision for humanity.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Generating Your Own Energy. What is super compelling about this chapter is how it grounds its massive, sweeping arguments at the most relatable individual level you can imagine, how we handle bad weather. The text points out a very human statistic, noting that over 90% of people feel unmotivated during the gloomy rainy season. We've all been there, right? But the author makes a really sharp point here. While it's completely normal to feel sluggish, letting the outside environment dictate your internal state of mind is a dangerous trap.
According to the text, the antidote to this sluggishness is a concept called self-generation, or in Japanese, jikahatsuden. Basically, this means actively creating your own positive energy and motivation. It's about consciously refusing to use your environment as an excuse for your attitude. The book frames this ability, generating your own light when it's dark and glooming outside, as an absolutely crucial prerequisite for true leadership. And this is exactly where the author connects the micro to the macro. Self-generation isn't just some life hack for a rainy Tuesday. The text outlines it as the very first step to forming what it calls a rich heart. Building this individual internal resilience is presented as the foundational building block humanity needs before we can even hope to face much larger existential challenges. Which brings us to Section 2, Heavenly Warnings Through Crises. Once the text establishes this need for inner resilience, the narrative scope widens dramatically. We transition from everyday weather complaints straight into catastrophic global events. The book asserts that humanity is currently standing on the precipice of a highly dangerous era, one defined by a succession of unprecedented, almost unbelievable crises that form a really terrifying pattern. To illustrate this pattern, the text lists a rapid succession of devastating events, from the 2004 Sumatra earthquake and tsunami, straight into Hurricane Katrina in the U.S. in 2005, followed by the Myanmar cyclone and the Sichuan earthquake in China, both in 2008. The author uses this sheer concentration of tragedy to emphasize the massive scale of the crises we're facing. But crucially, the author doesn't view these just as random geological or meteorological tragedies. Instead, they're interpreted as intentional warnings from heaven. The argument here is that these disasters are actually an expression of a higher will, a loud and clear signal that humanity's current trajectory is dangerously flawed and requires immediate correction. Let's look closer at that in Section 3, Balancing Material and Spiritual. So, if these disasters are a warning, what exactly is heaven warning humanity about? Well, according to the text, it's about a drastic imbalance between our physical world and our inner world. The book posits that while the last 150 years have brought incredible material development, think immense convenience, technological leaps, and scientific progress, humanity has fundamentally lacked the necessary spiritual development to match it. We've built the machinery of the future, but the text argues we lack the faith and the rich heart required to properly and safely wield this material wealth. The author warns that focusing solely on the material world completely destroys a vital balance. Without spiritual growth to temper our technological power, humanity becomes arrogant. And it's precisely this arrogance, this massive spiritual deficit, that the text claims is triggering those repeated crisis scenarios we just looked at. Moving right along to Section 4, the New Asian Era. The author doesn't just leave this spiritual imbalance floating in the abstract realm. He projects it directly onto international geopolitics. The text predicts a turbulent shift, forecasting that America is going to step back from its historic, post-war role as the world police. By shifting toward a more self-centered domestic approach, the U.S. leaves a massive power vacuum on the global stage. In the wake of this American retreat, the text asserts that the center of global gravity will shift dramatically. The balance of power is going to enter what the author terms the era of the Asian Three Kingdoms, a period driven by intense and perhaps chaotic competition between Japan, China, and India. But the book definitely doesn't frame this new era as a peaceful transition. Instead, it highlights severe impending danger. The text specifically warns about the existential threat that could come from expanding military capabilities and nuclear armament within this ageal theater, as these three powers vie for dominance in a spiritually unbalanced world. Finally, we reach Section 5, Japan's Vision for Humanity. Amidst all this impending geopolitical chaos and global spiritual deficit, the text outlines a very specific, urgent mission. According to the author, Japan has a unique duty in this new era. The text calls for Japan to establish a spiritually resolute foundation, not just for itself, but to transmit a unifying future vision to properly guide the rest of the world. The ultimate argument of this chapter is that Japan must generate and broadcast a future vision based on spiritual truth. The stakes, according to the book, literally could not be higher. This vision is required to prevent humanity from facing repeated, apocalyptic, end-of-the-world level catastrophes brought on by that huge imbalance of material wealth and spiritual poverty. And bringing this grand, global vision full circle, the text implies a pretty simple truth.
Establishing this global leadership requires the exact same kind of individual inner resilience introduced at the very beginning of the chapter. That conscious self-generation. You simply can't lead the world out of darkness if you don't know how to generate your own light. Which leaves us with a profound question drawn directly from our analysis today. Can humanity collectively generate the necessary spiritual resilience to survive the consequences of our own material progress? It's an incredibly compelling framework for looking at the challenges of our modern era, and definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself complaining about a rainy day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating text that proposes a highly unconventional and honestly, deeply intriguing view on global geopolitics. We're looking at the laws of salvation, specifically focusing on a section all about the conditions of a religious nation. Now, whether you're a student of international relations, theology, or philosophy, this source material is going to challenge you to look at the world map through a completely different lens. We're going to unpack the author's unique claims about the hidden, metaphysical forces driving the conflicts we see on the news literally every single day.
So, this is the massive question at the very heart of our explainer today. You know, we're so used to analyzing global conflicts, especially those in the Middle East, through the usual lenses, right? Territory, resources, historical grievances, political power. But the central premise of the source text we're examining argues something radically different. It suggests that these physical, earthly wars are actually manifestations of intense, metaphysical battles happening right now in the spiritual realm. Now, whether you fully buy into it or just treat it as a profound philosophical exercise, understanding this perspective completely shifts how you might consume your daily news.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the roots of the conflict. Second, a hidden spiritual battle. Third, the problem with monotheism. Fourth, freedom versus equality. And finally, Japan's Golden Age model. Starting with Section 1, Roots of the Conflict, from Geopolitics to Metaphysics. Before we can even begin to understand the metaphysical claims of the text, we have to look at the observable, physical realities. The author doesn't ignore history at all. Rather, they use these historical touchpoints as a launching pad. The argument is grounded in very real, very painful events, pointing all the way back to the 1948 UN resolution that led to the creation of Israel. The book highlights how, from the era perspective, this felt like Western powers forcibly taking their land. The author then traces this through decades of wars, specifically noting the late 2008 to early 2009 Israeli military assault on the Gaza Strip. Looking at this timeline, the source material concludes that standard politics just hasn't been able to solve this endless, brutal cycle of retaliation. And it's exactly the sheer persistence of this conflict that leads the author to look beyond the physical world for actual answers.
That brings us to Section 2, a hidden spiritual battle. Having established the earthly history, we're now pivoting to the author's controversial yet undeniably fascinating spiritual diagnosis of why this conflict just refuses to end. The text makes a staggering claim based on the author's professed spiritual investigations. The author actually asserts they've communicated with high-ranking spirits in the afterlife, specifically pointing to the spirit of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. According to the source material, this spiritual entity harbors deep, uncompromising resentment towards the establishment and existence of Israel, which heavily echoes that earthly sentiment we just talked about. The text reports this spiritual anger as the invisible fuel that's constantly reigniting the fires of conflict down on the ground. So the text frames this not just as an earthly battle, but as a massive cosmic proxy war. On one hand, representing the defense of the Islamic world, you have the spirit of Muhammad, and on the other, defending Judaism and the nation of Israel, is the Archangel Michael. The author asserts that these two immense spiritual figures are locked in this bitter clash in the spiritual realm, and because both are considered extremely high-level spirits, the text argues that their inability to compromise just reverberates straight down to humanity, making the physical wars between Israel and Islamic nations almost impossible to resolve through normal human diplomacy. And this brings us to what is probably the most urgent warning within the source material. The author observes the intense geopolitical friction we see today, especially between Israel and nations like Iran, and maps it directly onto this spiritual clash. The text warns that if this uncompromising, absolute battle between these spiritual backers continues to escalate, it seriously has the potential to ignite a devastating world final war. So, the author views the earthly friction not merely as regional politics, but as the potential flashpoint for a literal global catastrophe driven by these metaphysical forces. Moving on to Section 3, the problem with monotheism. So you might be wondering, if high-ranking spiritual beings are causing this much trouble, why is that the case? Well, the author analyzes the structure of the religions themselves, and this brilliantly illustrates the point. The author uses this highly evocative metaphor, comparing the rise of monotheistic religions to an inventory clearance sale. The argument is that ancient times were filled with these diverse polytheistic beliefs, but as strict monotheism rose to prominence, it acted like a massive restructuring. It aggressively swept away and erased the ancient gods of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and others, effectively replacing a diverse spiritual ecosystem with a very strict, single-point focus.
Let's break down the consequences of this so-called clearance sale. Monotheism demands absolute adherence to a single god, right? Well, the author argues this creates an inherent inability to compromise. Think about it. If there's only one true god, other faiths are essentially invalid. Therefore, when two monotheistic powers clash, the text suggests the fighting logically has to continue until one side completely falls. To back this up, the author points to the historical erasure of older religions like Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism, arguing that the karmic history of those erased faiths still haunts the Middle East today. It creates a pretty devastating zero-sum game of spiritual survival.
Which leads us to Section 4, Freedom versus Equality.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the author begins to offer a prescription. The text shifts focus to socioeconomic philosophy with a pretty shocking metaphor. It argues that a society focused entirely on forced equality, which the author likens to totalitarianism or a strict religious control, is fundamentally like a prison system. In a prison, everyone gets equal food, equal clothing, equal labor, but they have absolutely zero freedom. The author contrasts this with a free society. They acknowledge that sure, a free society allows for disparity and inequality, but the ultimate happiness of humans is higher because they possess the actual freedom to strive, to fail, and to achieve self-actualization.
This translates into a very direct plea to the Islamic world. The text suggests that relying on an ideology that prioritizes forced equality or blaming poverty entirely on the will of God actually stunts societal growth. Instead, the author strongly advocates for introducing the spirit of freedom and self-help. The argument here is that empowering individuals to work hard, innovate, and take responsibility for their own economic success will lead to way more overall happiness and prosperity than just waiting around for divine distribution or relying on state-mandated equality.
To really hammer home the need for this shift in perspective, the text offers a super relatable analogy. Religious differences often just boil down to deeply ingrained habits, like dietary restrictions. A Muslim might be physically repulsed by pork, while a Hindu feels the exact same way about beef. The author points this out to highlight a profound absurdity. Fighting absolute, bloody wars over what are essentially just different sets of rules and habits is frankly foolish. It's a very clear plea for basic human tolerance when it comes to superficial religious differences.
And finally, Section 5, Japan's Golden Age Model.
We've reached the climax of our explainer. We've seen the diagnosis of these spiritual wars and the structural flaws of monotheism. Now we reveal the text's ultimate proposed solution. The core concept proposed to save the world from this metaphysical warfare is religious harmony, and the author points directly to Japan as the blueprint. Why Japan? Well, because historically, Japan has demonstrated this incredible capacity to respect, absorb, and peacefully coexist with multiple faith traditions all at once. A person in Japan might participate in Shinto rituals, have a Buddhist funeral, and celebrate a culturally Christian Christmas, all without conflict. The author argues that this cultural ability to embrace religious plurality, rather than forcing a monotheistic inventory clearance, is the exact ideological antidote needed to cool the absolute conflicts of the Middle East.
The ultimate goal of these teachings, which are brought forth by the supreme god El Cantare in the source material, is not just to stop war, but to unify these disparate religions completely. By exporting Japan's model of religious tolerance and harmony, the author believes humanity can actually avoid that devastating world final war we talked about earlier. Instead, we can enter a harmonious golden age, paving the way for a brand new space age. It is a grand, sweeping vision that ties ancient spirits directly to our future prosperity.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today, from the physical timelines of Middle Eastern conflicts to the metaphysical battles of high spirits, and finally to a socio-economic argument for freedom and a plea for religious harmony. The source material presents a staggering, unified theory of global events. And it leaves us with this really provocative final thought to ponder. Can a model of religious tolerance, like the one historically seen in Japan, actually serve as the diplomatic and spiritual tool needed to prevent a catastrophic global war?
It's a question that asks us to rethink everything we know about global conflict. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and keep questioning the world around you.
All right, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Chapter 5 of Ryuho Okawa's The Laws of Salvation. And honestly, it paints this incredibly specific, genuinely fascinating picture of tomorrow. A place where faith, society, and hardcore scientific advancement absolutely collide. We're really digging into the core claims made in this text, and the paradigm it sets up it's bold. It argues that spiritual truths aren't just, quiet personal beliefs. No, they are the literal engines driving our societal and scientific evolution. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the spiritual revolution currently happening in Japan, unpack the seeds of the future, talk about wielding words as weapons, and finally explore the fusion of science and faith. Let's do it. Section 1. The Spiritual Revolution in Japan. Okay, so this revolution, it is driven by something highly unconventional. We're talking about the mass publication of what the text calls spirit messages. These are framed as direct communications from historical figures, and they are specifically designed to challenge our modern political and social norms. It's essentially a deliberate, massive jolt to contemporary society. And just to put the sheer scale of this effort into perspective, in the year 2010 alone, the organization published over 40 of these spirit message books. 40! That is practically one a week. They were recorded publicly, turned into books basically overnight, and heavily advertised, so they literally couldn't be ignored. Now, the author totally acknowledges the massive risk involved here. He actually calls it a real fight, staking credibility. By loudly proclaiming that the spirit world exists right here, right now, the organization is essentially putting its entire reputation on the line, all in an attempt to awaken the public. Moving right along, Section 2, Seeds of the Future and a Correct View of Life. According to the text, everything starts with getting your view of life straight. To really grasp this, you have to shed the false self, the version of you that's tied strictly to the material world. Instead, you need to realize that your true identity is a spiritual entity, a soul. You're just temporarily hanging out in a physical body. And honestly, that distinction, it's the absolute bedrock of this entire philosophy. So, by embracing this truth, the book claims you internalize the seeds of the future. Once that happens, your actions aren't just about your current 80-odd years on Earth anymore. They become actual, tangible investments in your eternal progression and, frankly, in the whole future of human society. Section 3. Fighting with Words as Weapons. Now, this is where things get really interesting. There is a hard line drawn against violent conflict in this text. Physical weapons, they just destroy lives and ruin the environment. Instead, what's being called for is a kind of ideological warfare. The idea is to use only words of truth to actually build the future and spread faith. But how do you actually wield these words in daily life? Well, the text says it takes profound courage. It means standing up and speaking spiritual truths in completely secular workplaces. It means challenging modern political common sense and just confidently asserting that truth is truth, even when it completely defies what society considers normal. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Science as an Extension of Faith. Ever since the days of Copernicus and Galileo, science and religion have basically been viewed as total opposites, right? Hostile forces. But the argument here is that modern science and medicine are actually hitting a wall. And the claim is that the only way forward, the only way to break through, is for science and religion to finally fuse together. To bridge that gap, the text points to Einstein's famous formula E equals mc squared. It argues that showing physical matter and invisible energy as interchangeable is actually a massive hint at unseen spiritual realities. It's used as a way to explain how physical substance literally emerges from divine thought. Mind-blowing, right? So it all comes down to a fundamental clash of paradigms. On one side, you have traditional scientific materialism, which just assumes physical matter is all there is, a strict dividing line between mind and matter. But on the other side, in a science rooted in faith, spirit and matter are completely deeply connected. We're talking about a paradigm where the very thoughts of God or Buddha literally create stars and biological life. And this whole argument leads right to the core thesis of the chapter. Future science is on the extension line of faith. The idea is that true, groundbreaking scientific advancement in the future is simply an extension of deep spiritual faith.
Embracing this spiritual reality is framed as the absolute key to unlocking humanity's next massive leap forward. So, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If our core essence really is spiritual, and if our words are our primary weapons for shaping reality, what kind of future will your words create? Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, highly specific spiritual roadmap for humanity. We're going to unpack the philosophical forecast for Earth's future, exactly as it's laid out in the book, The Laws of Salvation. Our goal today is to impartially break down the core concepts of this text, taking its complex spiritual frameworks and turning them into clear, structured takeaways. So if you've ever been curious about how spiritual movements envision global transformation, you are absolutely in the right place. For this explainer, we're zooming straight into a very striking section of the book, Chapter 6. The original Japanese title of this chapter translates to Forecast, and it carries this pretty weighty subtitle, What is the Power to Create the Earth's Future? You see, this chapter doesn't just toss out vague predictions. It actually proposes a highly structured, unique spiritual method for averting global crisis. It's basically asking us to completely rethink where the power to shape tomorrow actually comes from. So here's our roadmap for today. We're looking at the blueprint of tomorrow, ruling your own life, mercy as the key word, battling dark predictions, and finally, building the future society. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, the blueprint of tomorrow, building on the word. Before we get into what individuals are supposed to actually do, we need to understand the ground they're supposedly building upon. The text establishes right away that the upcoming future society will be constructed directly upon the words and teachings provided by the author. It states explicitly that these teachings aren't just, helpful advice for a good life. They are positioned as the literal architectural framework for a new era. And this is a crucial starting point because it frames every single subsequent instruction in the book not as a mere suggestion, but as a mandatory building block for a functional future. Moving right along to part 2, ruling your own life and the power of the mind. So now we're zooming inward. Once that foundation of teachings is set, the primary instruction is about taking uncompromising control over your own life. Drawing directly from the text, this quote really brilliantly illustrates the core mechanic at play here. Everything is up to your mind. Your mind is what will develop the future you and your country. Think about how often we look to external leaders or institutions to shape our society, right? Well, this text flips that entirely. It argues that the trajectory of a nation is simply the sum total of its citizens' internal mental states. You can actually see the imperative language used in the original Japanese text here. The author poses a very direct challenge to the reader, asking you to examine your own mind, because it's seen as the ultimate tool for personal creation. You aren't just passively experiencing your life, you are explicitly instructed to rule and create it. The idea is that the future isn't something that just happens to you, it's something you generate from within. Which brings us to part 3, mercy as the keyword, focusing on outward action. Okay, so you've theoretically mastered your own mind. How does that actually translate to how you interact with people? The crucial point here is how the text defines mercy, or jihi in Japanese. In everyday conversation, mercy usually means showing forgiveness, or maybe having pity. But the text defines it a bit differently. It describes mercy as the nature of actively desiring to give good things to others. So it's not passive at all. It's this proactive, outward-facing drive to impart good, to actually elevate the people around you based on that internal mental control you've established. And according to the author, embodying this specific, active definition of mercy is the single most essential element needed to shape a positive future society. The text actually designates mercy as the literal keyword for the future. The argument here is that if a society is composed of individuals who have ruled their own minds and are actively driven to give good things to one another, well, the foundation for a utopian future is practically set. Next up is part 4, battling dark predictions and the spiritual weapon. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds like a peaceful stroll into a golden age, right? Well, not exactly. Building this future requires fighting against the pessimistic trajectories currently facing our world. The text sets up a really stark contrast. On one side, we have the evil future predictions dominating the world. Think apocalyptic anxieties, societal collapse, general global pessimism. On the other side is the author's proposed solution, utilizing spiritual enlightenment as a weapon.
This is a fascinating use of terminology, honestly. Enlightenment here isn't just a state of Zen-like peace, it's militarized. It is a tool for ideological combat against a doomed forecast. The text demands an active battle. Individuals are expected to use their attained enlightenment to push back hard against these dark prophecies. You reject negative forecasts. You wield your spiritual understanding as a literal tool to change reality, and you purposefully combat pessimistic societal trends. It's essentially asking you to consider how your own philosophical outlook can act as a shield against the daily barrage of doom scrolling and global anxiety, completely overriding the world's default trajectory with this new blueprint. And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, Building the Future Society, the Ultimate Goal. Now we're pulling all the way back to the macro level. The culmination of this entire forecast requires faith in El Cantare. Within the framework of the text, El Cantare is the supreme spiritual figure that the author points to as the guiding force for this whole new era. The ultimate instruction for building the future society is inextricably linked to this belief. All that mental control and spiritual combat we just talked about, it's ultimately directed toward realizing the specific vision associated with this figure. And this really highlights the sheer scale of the book's ambition. As you can see on the book's English cover, this faith is positioned as the definitive key to rescuing the Earth. But it doesn't just stop at saving the planet. It explicitly states this will open a new way for the upcoming space age. So the text bridges this wild gap between ancient spiritual concepts like enlightenment and mercy and science fiction-esque futures of cosmic expansion. To summarize this whole conceptual journey, the text lays out a very clear, 4-step escalation. Step 1, control the mind, rule your internal state. Step 2, cultivate mercy, actively desire to give good to others. Step 3, weaponize enlightenment, use your spiritual growth to fight dark global predictions. And Step 4, believe in El Cantare, align with the supreme spiritual force to usher in a new space age. It's a highly structured, logical flow that takes you right from the individual mind all the way to the cosmic scale. Ultimately, regardless of your personal beliefs, the laws of salvation forces us to pause and ask a pretty provocative question. How much control does human willpower and spiritual belief truly have over the trajectory of Earth's future? Can structured mindsets and collective faith actually rewrite our collective destiny? It's a heavy question, for sure, and one that clearly drives the entire philosophy outlined in this text. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the blueprints of tomorrow.